Corey Walter, Sped 509, with a brief overview of Native American sovereignty. Tribal sovereignty, what is it? Why is it important? Let's take a look here and see what we can figure out about that today. We're also going to take a look at what is a sovereign nation, how did they get that way, a little bit of the history involved, as well as what kind of things can a sovereign nation do. Within the borders of Minnesota, there are 11 Native American tribes that are considered to be sovereign nations. This means they are separate from the state of Minnesota as well as separate from the United States of America, even though they're within our borders. What exactly is a sovereign nation? This is probably one of the questions that would be, the first thing that would be asked in this case. A sovereign nation can basically be any country of the world, along with any of the Native American tribes within the American borders. They are recognized by the federal government as an independent political body. They have all the rights and privileges of any nation of the world, as well as conducting treaties with the American government, which is something that each and every nation of the world can do. Who are the people in Minnesota that we look at when we think of Native Americans? The first is the Anishinaabe. They are comprised of the Ojibwe and the Chippewa. They had far-reaching lands that spread across northern Minnesota, into Canada, across Wisconsin and Michigan as well. Over time, these areas were eroded by the American government. Unfortunately, these lands were taken from the people to provide for other needs that the American government felt that they needed at the time. Currently, within Minnesota's borders, there are 7 reservations for the Ojibwe and the Chippewa people. They're primarily in the northern parts of the state and are pretty small compared to their previous holdings. The other people that make up the Native Americans within Minnesota are the Dakota. They're comprised of the Sioux, and they have 4 tribal communities in southern Minnesota, kind of in the south and the central parts of the state. Why are Native American nations considered to be sovereign? The tribes held their lands in the American continent long before the Europeans were here. They were here hundreds of years before the Europeans showed up. When the Europeans came here, there was a bit of a conflict there because, they needed lands to farm, they needed places for settlers to live, and there was already people here, so that led to conflict. The tribes that were here had their own forms of government, their own culture, they had their own way of living. Unfortunately, it was foreign to the incoming Europeans, and that caused conflict between the two groups. One of the early parts here that we can take a look at that really shaped the history of the American nation along with the Native American populations is the War of 1812. In 1776, the Revolutionary War was fought. This freed the American colonies from the British rule. In 1812, there was another conflict between the young American country and the British Empire. The War of 1812 was basically, in some cases, some people would consider it to be the Second War of Independence. The tribes were competing with settlers for the space, the resources of the land, everything that comes with 2 people that need the same thing. In the War of 1812, the tribes generally aligned with the British, basically to regain the land that they were losing to the Americans, to force the American settlers out, and to regain their own place in there. One of the interesting things that occurred here is that the British Empire offered the Native Americans their own sovereign lands. They were going to create a country for the Native Americans that would pretty much be part of Minnesota and parts of the Northwest Territory at the time. Unfortunately for the Native Americans won the war, and their hopes of getting their own country were pretty much lost at that point. In the 1800s, following the conclusion of the war, there was a really great push for Americans. They wanted to spread out. They wanted to push the boundaries of the western frontiers. Those western frontiers, not what we would think of today. We're talking areas like Ohio, Tennessee, the Mississippi River. These were the far western borders of the country back in those days. As the Americans were gradually spreading westward, the people that were already there were being forced out. They were relocating, leaving their areas so that they could kind of find some place where no one else would want to go. As this happened, the Native American tribes entered into treaties with the government that ceded their lands, but tried to retain some of the rights of their own peoples that they could take care of themselves. What kind of powers does a sovereign nation have? Let's take a look further here and see what they can do. They can establish their desired form of government. The Native American tribes were allowed to establish any type of government they wanted in order to effectively govern their people. See, in some cases, they modeled themselves after the American government, as well as kind of a combination of tribal traditions, as well as American governments. They have the power to determine membership. Who can be a member of the tribe? This is one of the biggest questions that was allowed for each of the tribes to determine, because they can restrict their membership so it's not just anyone that can be a member of any of their tribes. They set the rules on how you become a member. They're able to police and tax their people. By having an established police force, they're able to maintain law and order so that there's not just anarchy running wild in the streets. And they're allowed to levy taxes upon the people in their areas. Although it is important to notice here that Congress and the states, in some cases under Federal Reserve powers, may limit what the tribes can do. Let's take a look further here and see how those actions are limited. The Native American tribes are allowed their own justice system. They can administer civil and criminal justice under the court systems or under tribal traditions as they see fit. They're, however, limited by the federal government to certain limits on imprisonment and fines. Although in 2010, Congress did amend this limit and increased it a little bit, mainly to help out the tribes in some of the areas that they were seeing concerns. Each tribe has the right to an autonomous border. Basically, just like the United States of America has our borders with Mexico and Canada, and our government decides who can come in, who can't come in, and how you can establish or how someone can gain entry into our country. The native tribes retain that right as well. They can exclude trespassers. They can, just as our government can exclude trespassers from our borders. Although there are certain exclusions that do apply. Just like everything else, there's always rules. Federally funded roads, if the government pays for it, they can't close it. It has to be open to everybody. In some cases out west, there are major roads and highways that run right through the middle of a reservation, and those roads cannot be blocked or impinged by the tribes. They have to be open to everybody. Non-members that control, a member of someone who is not a member of the tribe that has control of the specific parts of the land within the reservation must be allowed access to their land. They cannot be excluded from that area. And in some cases, when there's federal officials that are providing services to the tribe or the members of the tribe, they are allowed access whether the tribe wants them there or not. The tribes retain the right to regulate business. They are allowed to charter businesses that can manage the tribe's assets, as well as organizing private businesses and corporations, just like any of the states can as well. Under this business formation that they're allowed came the Gaming Act of 1988. In my opinion, this is one of the more important aspects of tribal regulations that occurred, because up until this point, unfortunately, the tribes were relegated to areas and lands that no one really wanted. So they had not a lot of income coming in. They realized there was a big demand for gaming. Out in Las Vegas, it's huge, and there's a lot of money to be made. So the tribes effectively took it to court, and the Congress passed the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act, allowing them to run games within their own lands. The financial effects of gaming have been tremendous. Just this past July of 2016, the National Indian Gaming Commission released a report showing that for fiscal year 2015, total gaming revenue was $29.9 billion across 474 gaming operations. Just to put this into perspective, in 1992, just 4 years after the act was passed, the Pico tribe in Boston, who run the Foxwoods Casino, offered the state of Massachusetts the greater of $100 million annually, or 25% of the take of slot machines, if they were allowed the sole and exclusive use of slot machines in the state. This has been a brief overview of Native American sovereignty for Sped 509.